He was the only U.S. president to threaten total military financial backing to Israel. No other president's done it in history. Who was it? It was U.S. President John F. Kennedy. These series of letters were sent during John F. Kennedy's administration in 1963, where John F. Kennedy threatened Israel's prime minister at the time of losing total U.S. support. The series of letters was brought to light a few years back. However, it's been heavily suppressed in the mainstream media. Back in the 1960s, for those who don't know, Israel was trying to develop nuclear weapons. John F. Kennedy was heavily against nuclear proliferation and was trying to have United States scientists inspect Israel's nuclear reactor at Dimona. There was a series of letters between John F. Kennedy and Israel's prime minister at the time, David Ben-Gurion, which ultimately led to David Ben-Gurion resigning. I'm going to show you those letters in a second, but first take a listen to this clip here.
There's a very surprising series of letters between Kennedy and David Ben-Gurion, not only the premier of Israel, but the founder of Israel, in which they're very angry letters, in which Kennedy is saying to Ben-Gurion, I'm killing myself trying to get a nuclear test ban treaty. I've even got de Gaulle on board, and that's impossible. And you keep testing in Dimona. You've got to stop. And Ben-Gurion, thank you, in so many words says, it's easy for you to say sitting in Hyannisport. I'm sitting with the Arabs all around me, and you want me to give up nuclear testing. And Kennedy threatens him. And he threatens him in such a way that Ben-Gurion resigns. And I will tell you that I found articles, not in any crackpot publications, but in very sophisticated publications saying, forget Lyndon Johnson, forget the CIA, forget Fidel Castro. The Mossad killed Kennedy because they were so upset over what he did to Ben-Gurion.
So that's some pretty shocking allegations. I have the letters right over here, and I'm going to go ahead and start showing you guys them. Anybody can find these letters. If you go to the NSA archives.gw.edu, you could search up simply the Battle of the Letters on Google, and you'll be able to find them. It's, I believe, the first tab. There was a series of exchanges with John F. Kennedy and David Ben-Gurion at the time. While Israel was trying to develop nuclear weapons, John F. Kennedy was working very hard to stop global nuclear proliferation. You have to keep in mind that Israel was a very, very young country at the time. Wasn't even barely 20 years old. Israel's out here wanting to develop nuclear weapons. It wasn't even 20 years old, 13. And Israel wanted to develop nuclear weapons while John F. Kennedy was so against this. Israel stated that they were just focusing on doing nuclear research at their Dimona nuclear reactor site in the Negev desert. However, John F. Kennedy was suspicious, and he wanted American scientists to go in and inspect Israel's nuclear reactor. Israel refused, and they simply wouldn't allow John F. Kennedy to bring in scientists to inspect this nuclear facility. So it got to the point where John F. Kennedy was sending back and forth letters with Israel's prime minister at the time, David Ben-Gurion, over here, so much so that ultimately John F. Kennedy had enough, and he told David Ben-Gurion, if you don't, I will simply no longer support Israel. David Ben-Gurion was so upset with this that he resigned, and a new Prime Minister, Levi Eshkol, also took office, and John F. Kennedy didn't stop there. He just continued to pressure. Here's the letter that John F. Kennedy sent to Levi Eshkol at the time where he threatened total U.S. backing to Israel. Give me a moment. Let me just zoom in here. There you go. You should be able to see it now. You are aware, I am sure, of the exchanges which I had with Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion concerning Americans' visit to Israel's nuclear facility at Dimona. Most recently, the Prime Minister wrote to me on May 27th. This is coming from John F. Kennedy. His words reflect the most intense personal consideration of a problem that I know is not easy for your government as it is not for mine. We welcome the former Prime Minister's strong reaffirmation that Dimona will be devoted exclusively to peaceful purposes, and the reaffirmation also of Israel's willingness to permit periodic visits at Dimona. This is the part that is really shocking here. I'm sure I'm going to the second paragraph right here just to get right to it. I'm sure you will agree that these visits should be nearly as possible in accord with international standards, thereby resolving all doubts as to the peaceful intent of the Dimona project. As I wrote to Mr. Ben-Gurion, this government's commitment to and support of Israel could be seriously jeopardized if it should be thought that we were unable to obtain reliable information on a subject as vital to peace as the question of Israel's efforts in the nuclear field. And it goes on, therefore, I ask our scientists to review the alternative schedules of visits that you had proposed. This is the thing that people need to understand. When you're talking in political correctness, where you're having exchanges with companies and you're not going to obviously swear and you're not going to cuss. So when people read that, they're expecting him to just be, this was prior to Donald Trump era. So the fact that we had an American president at the time, regardless of how polite it sounded, ultimately threatening total U.S. backing to Israel. Okay, no support, no military support, nothing. Commitment to and support of Israel could be seriously jeopardized. When you are reading that as the leader of a country, a very young country at the time, Israel was 1963, a very young country at the time, and it's surrounded by enemies. You have to realize the geopolitical landscape of the Middle East back in 1963 is a lot different than it is today. Back in 1963, there were actually Arab countries. There were powerful Arab countries. They were backed by the Soviet Union at the time. They were powerful. They had their own military. Nowadays, Jordan, Egypt, Syria is completely broken apart, so you don't see them as much of a threat to Israel whatsoever anymore. Back then, there was a real risk, and this was prior to Israel having any sort of nuclear deterrence. So Israel basically completely relied on its allies to keep it alive at the time. And until today, it does so with weaponry. It couldn't survive without all of those defense missiles from the Iron Dome. But it was particularly different at that time and much more of a risk, especially without nuclear deterrent. So, of course, Levi Eshkol, Israel's prime minister at the time, after David Ben-Gurion resigned, sees this letter and became very shocked and upset that somebody like John F. Kennedy could say such a thing. So this is what Levi Eshkol responded back. Let me just go ahead and share my screen there. There it is, and you see it. Here we have, Dear Mr. President, I have received your letter transmitted. I should like to thank you very sincerely, Mr. President, for your friendly congratulations on my assumption of office. And it goes on and on and on. And this is where I really want to share. Eshkol said that he personally wished to make 2 points orally. He referred to Ben-Gurion's letter to the president dated on May 12th, and noting that his government is one of continuity, and said the ideas of solutions proposed by his government and colleagues, and they anticipate with a special interest. Okay, let's just get to the straight part. Here we are. One sentence in President's letter of July 5th that referring to possible jeopardizing of U.S. commitment and support has caused him, quote, surprise. He said, searching for the right word. Israel would do what it had to do for its national security and to safeguard its sovereign rights. He would prefer to believe that in the pursuit of this Israeli-U.S. friendship would grow, a hope in which his colleagues fully concurred. I said I had no additional clarification of sentence to which he referred, the last paragraph, but my interpretation was that statement therein is factual. So now we're having Kennedy's aide, who he's speaking with here, telling Levi Eshkol, when Levi Eshkol was concerned, actually surprised, as he said it, that John F. Kennedy is threatening him. We have JFK's aide saying everything that JFK said is factual, when now Levi Eshkol is seeking reaffirmation. Imagine you're the prime minister of Israel at the time, and you're hearing the United States might ditch you. And then you're hearing the aide come to you and be like, yep, that's actually what the president said. Sorry, sucks to suck. This is basically what's going on. Imagine you have no nuclear weapons. You can't defend yourself against all of the other Arab states. What would you do if you were Israel and you realized that a U.S. president proposed an existential crisis for you? That's what Israel felt like it was like. Israel felt John F. Kennedy was posing an existential crisis to its state. Whether you want to believe that or not, John F. Kennedy promised Israel they would have assurances. And he said that we would back you guys in the event something were to happen. He did say that. However, he never went so far to say that the United States would fight wars on behalf of Israel. Actually, Levi Eshkol specifically wanted John F. Kennedy to give assurances that if something happened, since John F. Kennedy didn't want Israel to develop nuclear weapons, Levi Eshkol says, okay, well, if you don't want us to develop nuclear weapons, then promise us if something were to happen to Israel, you guys would back us. That's what Levi Eshkol now is saying. He's basically like, and I'm going to show you guys in a second, he's like, okay, fine. If you guys don't want, if the United States doesn't want Israel to have nukes, then you, Mr. President Kennedy, promise us that if one of the Arabs attack us, you 100% have our back, and then we don't need to worry about nukes. And we'll go ahead and read it right here. Let's see. Eshkol asked how we would view a possible proposal from Israel that Israel would consult the U.S. in advance in the event that sometime in the distant future, Israel would embark on a nuclear weapons program. And it goes on and on. I said I could not answer. I have no information. Let's see. I conclude by reiterating the importance the U.S. attaches to problems of nuclear proliferation, emphasizing the specific relation to Israel but worldwide. And it would go on. And let me see where I can find this part here where he's basically saying we want to know that the United States has the U.S.'s back. There are a number of suspicious people less than favorably disposed to close U.S.-Israeli relations. This is where Levi Eshkol was saying that prior. Now, let me just get to the part where John F. Kennedy responds when Levi Eshkol says, okay, well, you know, we are the only state in the international community whose existence is challenged and indeed openly threatened by all of its neighbors. This gives Israel's security problem a unique intensity and urgency. And he's responding back to the letter. And let me now go and share my screen here again. You guys should be able to see this. And we'll go to the next letter that John F. Kennedy responded back. Because if you think that John F. Kennedy was going to say, okay, we'll go ahead and fight wars on behalf of Israel if something were to happen, since we're not going to let you guys develop nuclear weapons, we're heavily opposed to that, you're wrong. John F. Kennedy actually had some balls at the time, and he even told Israel, we're not going to let you develop nuclear weapons. Not only that, Israel, if you were to get in wars, we'll make sure to back you. We promise to back you, but you can't expect the United States to go ahead and fight wars for you. John F. Kennedy said that. So now imagine you're president and you're not even getting the assurances. You're the Prime Minister of Israel, Levi Eshkol, and you're not even getting the assurances from JFK that he would at least back you and fully defend you if something were to happen to Israel, while not allowing them and not wanting them to have nuclear weapons. This is how tough John F. Kennedy was on Israel. Okay? So now imagine that you're the Prime Minister of this country and you feel like this president in front of you is posing an existential crisis, while his vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson, loves Israel and he's completely subservient to the Zionist interests. So what would you start to think of as a prime minister of Israel? If you know one guy's in your way, the other guy loves you, what would you do? So let me pull up here the response that John F. Kennedy sent to Levi Eshkol. Here it is, document Near East limitations, Israel's security guarantees. That's what I was looking for. Let me see if it shows my screen here. There we go. There we go. The president thought it's best not to take any special action with respect to Israel right now. For the moment, the dialogue could be continued between the ambassador and Eshkol. The Israelis will attempt to bargain for a security guarantee. This is what Israel was asking for. If you don't want us to develop nukes, give us a security guarantee that you'll fight for us if shit hits the fans. The Israelis will attempt to bargain for a security guarantee. In any case, Mr. McCone says they have not been doing very much on nuclear activity recently. Mr. Ball pointed out that successful conclusion of a test ban agreement should provide an opportunity to test Israeli intentions. And it goes on. Let's see here. Nasser, the president of Egypt at the time, had pointed out that Israelis have a nuclear potential while he does not. He would be glad to know what they are doing, but he himself had done nothing to inspect. Of course, Egypt was worried that if Israel was going to go nuclear, then Egypt's president at the time, who was a very powerful president, a lot of people loved him, they were worried that Egypt was going to go nuclear, which is exactly the reason why JFK was so opposed to Israel going nuclear, because then the Arabs would want to go nuclear as well. He would be willing to reply. President Kennedy said he would be willing to reply to a presidential letter on nuclear weapons and not attacking Israel. Oh, it seems a president of Egypt. Excuse me. Let's see here. The president then noted that some inspection. It goes on. It talks about Israel, the inspection of Israel's nuclear site at Dimona. And it talks about how the president of the United States also wants to perform bilateral inspections with the Israelis and the Egyptians. Let's see if it goes on. And this continues to talk about, there we go. Mr. McCoy suggested that any inquiry in Israel be held off until we know where we stand with respect to a security guarantee for Israel. The president said that a letter from Nasser might be useful. So basically, this entire thing goes on, and it says that President Kennedy simply is still questioning whether or not to give a security guarantee to Israel. Israel does eventually reach back out and asking, and the president says, we can't promise you directly that we'll be able to issue the security guarantee that you want. Here we are. This is what I was trying to look for. Now, Levi Eshkol, again, is responding back, and he says, I desire, Mr. President, to confirm Ben-Gurion's clear assurance to you and the character and purpose of the Dimona reactor. He's basically promising him that this reactor is just simply for research. I'm fully conscious I am of the special intimacy relationships between the United States and Israel, the reason for our two governments to be in close touch on this issue, yada, yada, yada. So I'll pull it up in the next episode, on the next video I do between JFK and Israel. But now you have to realize that while all of this was going on, the Israeli and Hebrew media at the time was going crazy in regards to JFK. They were infuriated with John F. Kennedy. This is a clipping I actually took from Israeli media. Israel condemns the behavior of the U.S. delegation at the United Nations. So while John F. Kennedy was trying to stop Israel from developing nuclear weapons, John F. Kennedy was also doing two other things that Israelis hated. He was trying to stop Israel. He was trying to stop the Israel lobby in the United States, and he was trying to force them to register as a foreign agent. And he was also pushing and putting forward a UN resolution at the United Nations that Israel accepts the 800,000 or so Palestinians that were displaced in 1947 to return back. So he was doing three things Israel hated. This is the U.S. Letter from the New York Times. U.S. stand angers Israel. This was the day before JFK's assassination, November 21st, 1963. Jerusalem, Premier Levi Eshkol expressed extreme distaste today for the United States position in the Palestine refugee debate. Israel's anger was conveyed in the strongest terms to the United States ambassador. And on top of that, David Ben-Gurion also wrote a letter to American Jewish leaders here in the United States. And he says, in regards to the refugee plan that John F. Kennedy was bringing forward, Israel will regard this plan a more serious danger to her existence than all the threats of the Arab dictators and kings, than all of the Arab armies, than all of Nasser's missiles and his Soviet MiGs. Israel will fight against this implementation down to the last man. Do you guys understand? We're having Israeli officials and the Prime Minister of Israel stating that they believe that John F. Kennedy's plan is more of a threat to its existence than all of the Arab enemies. So you're telling me that the guy's saying John F. Kennedy is a bigger enemy than all of the Arab enemies. This is how badly they view JFK. They thought he was truly enemy number one. And if anybody tells you otherwise, they simply just don't understand this relationship. The only sort of argument they'll say for John F. Kennedy not having this animosity towards Israel is that John F. Kennedy allowed Israel to have Hawk missiles. He sold Hawk missiles from the United States to Israel. John F. Kennedy did sell missiles to Israel at the time. He sold them Hawk missiles, and he did so in the letter. This is also verified, and I'll show in my next part on these letters. He sent them Hawk missiles on the stipulation that Israel would stop and make sure and allow U.S. nuclear scientists to come in and inspect Israel's nuclear sites. He basically said, fine, don't allow American inspectors to come in and see the Dimona nuclear site, and we'll allow the sale of Hawk missiles. That was the entire game. That was basically the negotiation. Of course, Israel didn't hold up on their part of the argument, on their part of the bargain, and JFK allowed the sales of the missiles. And Israel came into the United States, and there were Israeli IDF officers in the United States training on how to use these missiles. And JFK was assassinated, of course, and Israel continued its nuclear proliferation. So this is the deep hatred Israeli officials had with John F. Kennedy. I mean, what other presidency could you imagine Israel condemning the United States? You imagine reading a headline where Israel condemns the United States. This is kind of the situation. This is the situation that was going on with JFK's presidency. Now, This I'll have to explain in a completely different video, because I can honestly go on and on and on about the whole JFK thing, is that while John F. Kennedy was trying to stop Israel from developing nuclear weapons, the CIA chief at the time was actually helping and aiding Israel in its nuclear weapon development. Some of you guys might know James Angleton. James Angleton was the CIA chief during JFK's administration. He was a staunch Zionist. He was a Christian. He was a Christian, but a super staunch Zionist. During his early years in his 20s in World War II, he was actually helping Jewish refugees escape the Holocaust. So he was a very staunch Zionist. This guy here. Let me see if I can show you guys a better view of my screen there. There we go. This guy. So he was an American spy. He was the CIA chief at the time during JFK's administration. While John F. Kennedy's administration was trying to stop Israel from developing nukes, he was working with Israeli Mossad officers, not only sending them nuclear secrets, but he was also helping them trying to reach and gain access to nuclear equipment and nuclear weapons material. And the United States, the way Israel developed its nuclear weapons is it obviously needed radioactive material. Well, Israel stole that radioactive material from the United States. It was called the Numek Affair, and it stole radioactive material from a Pennsylvania plant back again in the late 1960s. At this point, JFK had already been assassinated, and this is now in Lyndon B. Johnson's administration, where the Israelis were coming into the United States and taking radioactive equipment, radioactive plutonium, from Numek, the Numek plant. So, anyways, back to James Angleton, though. Guys, I could go on a rant. I can continue to talk about this like crazy. James Angleton was the CIA chief of counterintelligence at the time, and when he was tasked, and I'll show more JFK documents in the next video I do, and I have a whole list of documents of James Angleton talking to the Senate, because they interviewed him, and during the JFK assassination as well, the JFK assassination hearing, the Warren Commission, he was going back and forth, and they asked James Angleton, what would you do in a situation where there was a conflict of interest between the United States and Israel? This is somebody in the Senate during the Senate committee asking James Angleton what you would do. And James Angleton became infuriated with the question itself. I'll go ahead and I already have a video I made on this previously, so I'll go ahead and post a short later today with James Angleton and with the documents being shown regarding this. I just don't have them saved right now on my computer. I apologize. James Angleton was so infuriated with the questioning of how the U.S. Senate could even question a conflict of interest between the United States and Israel, that this guy goes on and says, "What do you mean? There would never be a conflict of interest between the U.S. and Israel." And he refused to respond back. And he was so aggravated, you could tell. And he was like, well, if there was a conflict of interest, I would just do what you do when you have a fight with a friend. And the Senate Select Committee was like, what are you talking about? What do you do when you have a conflict of interest? And he says, well, I'll just stop talking to them for a while, and then I'll get back to them. And it was a very, very brief point during the interrogation of James Angleton. And then he has no problem, however, during that entire investigation, spending hours and hours and hours talking about the Soviets and talking about Cuba and talking about the Russians. Because obviously, during the JFK Assassination Commission, he was the guy who was in charge of providing the Warren Commission with all of the evidence. James Angleton at the CIA was in charge of providing the Warren Commission with all of the evidence regarding JFK's assassination while the man was compromised and sending Israelis nuclear weapon equipment and nuclear secrets, while John F. Kennedy's administration was trying to do the exact opposite and stop the proliferation of nuclear weapons. Now, it gets even worse. And once I saw this, I was like, all right, where our government's messed up. This dude, basically, it was a CIA Mossad operation. This is crazy. When James Angleton passed away, and I believe he passed away in 1987, I believe it was, when he passed away, the Israeli government held a funeral for him and held a ceremony for him in Israel. And not only that, if you go to Israel today, the Israeli government put up a memorial for him that you could still find in parks in Israel. Let me pull up the memorial in Israel, because once you see this, you're like, okay, like, why in the hell does Israel have a memorial for a Israeli Mossad officer, for a US CIA officer. What sort of relationship is this in any world where James Angleton would have his own memorial in Israel? Let me go ahead and open this image in a new tab. There we go. Now you should be able to see it. In memory of a dear friend, James Jim Angleton, from 1917 to 1987. This you can go find in Israel today. Okay. In what world would a foreign government decide to have a memorial for a CIA officer? Why? What the hell do the Israelis care about for a CIA officer? Now, when this ceremony took place, the Israeli mayor at the time said that nobody helped Israel. Nobody helped Israel as much as James Angleton did, and he helped Israel through the most difficult period in all of U.S.-Israeli relations. The Israeli mayor clearly was talking about helping Israel through the most difficult period, which was JFK's administration. Okay, the Israelis viewed JFK as the biggest liability and biggest threat to Israel's existence. Was not the Arabs. It was not Egyptian President Nasser. It was not the Syrians. It was not the Soviet Union giving the Syrians missiles and weaponry. It was none of that. They viewed JFK as the biggest threat to Israel's existence. And of course, the CIA chief at the time, was doing the exact opposite. And he loved the Israelis. Lyndon B. Johnson, of course, loved the Israelis. And Lyndon B. Johnson himself said, after JFK's assassination, you lost a friend, but now you have an even better friend. And then what happens just 4 years after JFK is assassinated? Well, the 1967 war happens. And all of a sudden now Israel has control of Gaza and the West Bank. You think that war would have happened had JFK been alive? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. It would have never happened. JFK would have never let it happen because they wouldn't have had the U.S. backing that they did. You think if JFK was alive, the USS Liberty would have been struck down? Absolutely not. The Israelis shot down the USS Liberty and they bombed the hell out of it, and Lyndon B. Johnson covered it up. You think JFK would have allowed that war to happen and allowed Israel to even have those ammunitions, let alone bomb a U.S. ship and hide it from the American public? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. So this is why it's so important that, this is why, I'm Palestinian. I've said this a lot before. And I think that me being Palestinian in a weird way makes me love JFK that much more, because the more I read about him, the more I'm like, damn, there really was a US president that really actually gave a shit about being right and like doing things right and actually having amicable relations with the Arabs and everything else. And when you peel back history and you're like, wow, U.S.-Israeli relations, the way that our politicians today talk about how we have this inseparable relationship with Israel, it wasn't always like this. It wasn't always like this. They say, and Israeli newspapers will say this as well, that it was Lyndon B. Johnson that forged the U.S.-Israel relationship. So prior to Lyndon B. Johnson, this sort of relationship was not there. The AIPAC lobby, the Israel lobby, was something John F. Kennedy was trying to stop from happening. So imagine now, again, we live in a world where JFK was never assassinated. Well, Israel would not be meddling in our elections today. Fact. AIPAC would be registered as a foreign agent. Fact. Okay. 1967 war would have never happened. Fact. They say, oh, well, the Arabs, attacked Israel in the 1967 war, and that's how things really started. Well, first off, that's a BS story. Second off, it would have never happened because John F. Kennedy would have ended up fixing and would have ended up stopping and forcing Israel to give concessions prior to the war. Because if 800,000 or so Palestinians that John F. Kennedy was urging Israel and pushing at the UN to return back to their homes, why would a war have started if 800,000 Palestinians that were kicked out of their homes in 1947 returned back? There wouldn't have been. You guys get it? So everything would be astronomically different today. All the Middle Eastern countries that have been bombed for Israel since JFK's assassination, especially from 1990 onwards, do you think all that would have likely happened if there was a peace agreement back in the 60s? So, I'll just stop there for this video. It's been about 30 minutes now, and there was like 5 other videos I was supposed to do today for you guys, or 4 other ones I still have in the works. Also, guys, if you like this video and you like me ranting on, would really appreciate some super chats, so I can just kind of do this as a full-time job. It means a lot. If you haven't clicked the subscribe button below as well, would greatly appreciate it. So that's really everything, I guess. I mean, honestly, I've spent a year doing John F. Kennedy assassination research, so the amount of documents and footage I do have saved, is ridiculous. So I'll try to do a more like I'll try to do things more in little bite-sized pieces, and I'll have those other documents I wanted to share ready for you guys in the next video. So that's everything for this video. I think I'm gonna revert back to another Epstein video now here in a second. So hope you guys found this interesting. Otherwise, I will see you guys in the next video. Take care.